Goeiedag, dames en heren, en welkom bij ons programma dat u wat meer zal vertellen over IDB Invest. IDB Invest is een particuliere instelling verbonden aan de Inter-Amerikaanse Ontwikkelingsbankgroep. IDB Invest heeft 26 leden die gevestigd zijn in het Caribisch gebied en Latijns-Amerika. IDB Invest werkt voornamelijk met bedrijven uit de particuliere sector. Sinds 2016 heeft IDB Invest haar aanwezigheid in de regio sterk uitgebreid. Ze hebben dit gedaan door elk land een eigen vertegenwoordiger te geven en ook heeft elk land een eigen investeringsteam dat samenwerkt met zowel de publieke als de particuliere sector. Deze inspanningen hebben erin geresulteerd dat IDB Invest in de afgelopen jaren een verhoogde interesse heeft kunnen opmerken voor het samenwerken met de organisatie, dit vanuit de particuliere sector. IDB Invest is ook actief in Suriname en daar gaat ons programma over vandaag. Wat is de rol van IDB Invest en wat kan deze organisatie betekenen voor ons land? Voordat we overgaan tot het interview waarin deze vragen worden beantwoord, presenteer ik graag mijn gasten aan u. Wij zijn IDB Invest, een bank die oplossingsgericht investeert in de economie, de vooruitgang van Latijns-Amerika en het Caribisch gebied op sociaal en milieugebied. Wij zijn jonge makers, bedrijfsontwikkelaars, voorstanders van gendergelijkheid en voorvechters van duurzaamheid. IDB Invest anticipeert op marktveranderingen en biedt oplossingen via financiële en niet-financiële innovaties. Wij trekken nieuwe bronnen naar de regio voor transport, energie, sociale infrastructuur, water- en sanitaire voorzieningen, duurzaam toerisme, technologie, media, telecommunicatie en agrobusiness. Onze klantgerichte mentaliteit en synergie met de IDB-groep biedt onze klanten mogelijkheden als geen ander. En dit alles met een positieve impact. Vooruitkijkend zullen we standvastig blijven in de ontwikkeling van infrastructuur, terwijl we onze ondersteuning uitbreiden naar nieuwe sectoren en oplossingsgerichte aanpak bieden aan onze klanten. Dit is onze missie. En als dit is bereikt, bedrijven zijn gegroeid, zullen er banen zijn gecreëerd en zullen levens verbeteren. Dus laten we samenwerken, want uw bedrijf is onze impact. Meneer James Scriven is CEO van IDB Invest. Hij heeft zich in de afgelopen 5 jaar ingezet om de ontwikkelingsbank op te bouwen tot een sterk instituut dat zich inzet voor het verbeteren van het welzijn van de mensen via de particuliere sector. Mevrouw 𝐒𝐁, zij is de vertegenwoordiger van Suriname in het bestuur van de Inter-Amerikaanse Ontwikkelingsbankgroep en tevens fungeert zij als spokesperson tussen de Surinaamse overheid en de IDB-groep. Good day, Mr. Scriven, and of course, Ms. 𝐒𝐁, and thank you for taking the opportunity to inform us a little bit more about IDB Invest, and of course, the role that this organization can play in the economy and the development of Suriname. Let's get over to our first question. How have the IDB and IDB Invest supported Suriname during the pandemic?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a pleasure to meet you. I would start by saying that with the recent visit of the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Foreign Affairs to our offices, it was a good opportunity for us to take a stock of what has been our engagement with Suriname during the last few years, and in particular, how can we continue to support Suriname during this pandemic. I would start by saying that in the past, the sectors in which we worked in particularly are focused on reactivating the economy, alleviating the consequences of a pandemic, and injecting capital and knowledge into a country that is badly needed at this stage. We're very optimistic about the medium and long-term prospects of Suriname, and that's why not only we have invested in the past, but we will continue to double down our investments in the country. That has not been the case in the past, and I'd like to ask my colleague and member of the board what has been her experience in the last few years that she's become a director representing your country on the board of IDB and IDB Invest, of what has been that journey to take us to the stage at which we are today.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Odette. I'm happy to share my experience, and as James is saying, we've seen a lot of increased collaboration between the IDB Group and Suriname. And the IDB Group has a long and extensive work relationship with Suriname, but rightfully said, not exactly with the IDB Invest, looking at our private sector. So let's go back. So when I came here as a member of the board representing Suriname, I had a strong view that we had to push more for private sector engagement in not only Suriname, but also the other small countries. This because we have similar challenges within our countries, looking at economies of scale and ecosystems, etc. So it was really a joint effort for us to come together to work with the administration in developing action plans, in seeing, okay, what can we do to get that physical presence, to get the presence of the IDB Invest and the private sector in these countries. So I think we had 4 main pillars that we really discussed, and one of the main things and the first things was we need physical presence in the region. We didn't have the nationals who know the private sector and the environment that we work in very well, because these were unknown territories for the IDB Invest at that time. And for me especially, it was also very important because Suriname is one of the, or is the only actually, borrowing member countries who doesn't speak one of the official languages of the IDB. So it was very important for me to have somebody in Suriname who does speak the language as well as knowing our private sector. And second, and this was also out of experience coming here, I think I was 4 months in as a representative, and we had the country strategy for Suriname at the board. And one of the first questions I asked was, well, where is the private sector strategy? And at that time, the answer was, we don't have a specific strategy for the private sector. That just comes along the way. So the first thing I thought, well, that could not work very well if you don't have a strategy up hand. So the board was very good in pushing the administration to have a more aligned IDB group country strategy, where we have a portfolio now, a robust portfolio, in having collaborative work with the IDB and the private sector, the IDB Invest, in developing these country strategies. So that was the second part. And then the third part was not only having these action plans in place, but also the right incentives for the people on the floor, on the ground in the countries, to really do more projects in our countries, and not only the bigger, more sexy projects that we've done before, but also seeing what kind of impact we can bring in the smaller countries. And I think the fourth one that was also very personal to me was for the IDB as a whole to get to know Suriname better. So not only the administration, but also the board. So I tried to bring as many people as I could to Suriname. So I brought the whole board, the sitting board at the time, the president, you, James, you were the first one as the IDB Invest CEO to visit Suriname. But to really get the sense and to experience, what Suriname is about and the opportunities we have in the private sector. So I think those were the main things that we really focused on, and now seeing that we have much better collaboration with the private sector as well.
Thank you for that answer. The pandemic is, of course, a situation that the whole world is dealing with, not only Suriname. In Suriname, we have an extra challenge, and that is our economic situation. What role can the private sector play in the recovery of the economy in Suriname?
I would start by saying that my answer is not unique to the country of Suriname, but is applicable to our 26 member countries, and then I can zoom into Suriname itself. I would start by saying that with the new administration, the new president of the IDB Group, Mauricio Claver-Carone, we came together as a leadership team and came up with a view that's called Vision 2025 of what should be a growth-led recovery of our region. And that has a number of components that we are gearing up to further strengthen. One, green recovery, sustainable recovery, inclusive recovery. So all these aspects of building back better are going to be a main focus of what is the recovery that we plan to do in many of the countries that we work in. The second one is private sector-led recovery. It's not unique to Suriname, but many of the countries in the region have used their very limited fiscal space to be able to have a very quick response to the health crisis that all our countries are facing. But as a consequence of that, have left behind a number of other sectors that are vital to the recovery of the economy. So this is the role and the responsibility of the private sector to step in. So that's the framework in which we operate in Suriname. As Jade was saying just now, we had to adapt our product, our people, and our services to adapt to the Suriname. So one thing that we did over the last 3 or 4 years is to get to know Suriname. We've got people on the ground. We visited the country. I had the privilege to going twice. The president has gone. So there's a number of people that have gone, either from the region or from Washington, D.C., to get to know the country quite well. And that has taken us to scale up our activities and to get very comfortable with us investing with the private sector. 3 areas that we're going to focus on, and then we can go into a bit more detail if you please. One is job creation. The single most important wave of recovery will be through the creation of jobs. That jobs have a number of characteristics that are particularly about inclusive job creation. Women, for example, not only have lost more jobs in the pandemic, but have been neglected in the increasing in jobs created post-pandemic. So this is an important activity. The gender inclusive, diverse way of job creation is a big pillar of the work that we're doing. Second, and related to that, is financial sector. As we know, SMEs around the world, and in particular in Suriname, are faced with significant financial constraints to continue to grow and provide services and jobs. And through that, we work with financial institutions and non-bank financial institutions in the country to be able to inject flows to the banks and for them to on-lend to medium and small size enterprises in the economy. And the third, and very important, reactivate infrastructure and energy. We know that with the discoveries in the country of Suriname as well as in Guyana, but in particular in Suriname, there's a number of physical infrastructure that needs to be built to be able to harness the potential of those discoveries. And with limited fiscal space that the governments are facing today, we are called in as an institution to be able to reactivate and work on those specific infrastructure projects to be able to reignite and invest in the country.
Yeah, let me chime in on that as well. Looking at the COVID crisis, we've seen that Latin America and the Caribbean have been hit one of the hardest in the world. And one of the IDB papers showed that 50 million people lost their jobs. And James, you mentioned, especially women suffering from the pandemic. And I cannot stress enough that, especially during this unprecedented time, it is crucial for governments to work together with the private sector because governments cannot bear the burden of the crisis alone. So we really need this joint effort of both the public and the private sector to start with the recovery phase and to see sustainable development. And you are naming a couple of areas that we're looking at, right? Like infrastructure, so we can look at what can public-private partnerships mean for countries like Suriname, especially in this time that we are in. And looking at opportunities in the health sector as well and manufacturing. So, and what you just said about the small and medium enterprises, 98% of the small and medium enterprises or of the private sector are small and medium enterprises, and that equals approximately 60% of employment in Suriname of the private sector. So we really need to put emphasis on this. And you just mentioned the financial injection via the financial institutions, and that is one of the examples that we can use the private sector to develop the different sectors within our countries, and in this case in Suriname. So we had last year, I guess, we signed the first credit line with the IDB Invest in Suriname, And this means a lot because we can now have financial injections towards the rest of the sectors via the private sector because, of course, the government cannot just, as I said before, bear the burden alone. So it's very crucial at this time to have those partnerships.
As we know, IDB Invest works with companies from the private sector, and you've already explained that also in Suriname that's the case. Can you tell us a little bit more about what companies IDB Invest has financed in Suriname up until now?
Yes, and I'll try to put it in the same buckets that Jade was referring to just now. Let me start by the financial sector. One of the key sectors that we look at in any form of recovery is activating regional and global integration of Suriname into the world. And with that, we've got a trade facility in which we provide guarantees to a number of financial institutions in Suriname for them to be able to access foreign direct investments through trade. 3 examples of that. The first bank that we started working was FINABank. We've got a trade facility available to them. Second, we started working with Hakrim Bank. We were opening and finalizing a trade facility already to be able to use with them. And third, a foreign investor that is Republic Bank that has a bank in Suriname, and we've opened 3 lines. So today we've got existing 3 lines available for more than $40 million available to do trade with those banks and foreign banks for imports and exports into Suriname that brings in hard currency into the country. Second, job creation. We have worked with both financial institutions and in the corporate sector with companies to be able to expand facilities and create jobs and services. An example of that is also FINABank. The credit line that Jade was referring to is a line that we closed last year to be able to provide money to FINABank, for FINABank to provide money to small and medium-sized enterprises. And second, we've invested in corporates. The Fernandez Group is a group that we've worked with very closely, and recently we financed an expansion of their bakery company to be able to do a new facility. So those are 2 examples in the corporate sector. Last but not least, in the infrastructure space. In recent conversations that we've had with the government, we started exploring what are the physical infrastructure activities that are vital for reactivating the economy and where we can step in as the private sector. We're looking at roads, we're looking at ports. Recently, the minister asked me to look in particular hospital infrastructure to see if we can work. So those are the particular sectors and what we're looking at. And shortly, you should be getting news public about some of those investments that we're doing.
Just to add on that, we are pushing in the board to focus more on technical assistance. So what is very important for our countries is the non-financial additionality. It is so important and so vital for us, looking at the experience we now have with the FINABank and exploring more of our financial institutions to upgrade them in order to be able to operate on an international level, and also having that technical assistance, but keeping the knowledge and experience in Suriname with our local people, with our local institutions. So we'll keep on pushing the IDB Invest, but I think the IDB Group as a whole, to have more of these technical assistant projects, because these are crucial as well for real sustainable development.
That's a great point, Jade, and let me go into a bit more detail of what that means for us and what that means for Suriname. Jade referred to technical assistance. We've got a number of streams that are important and are cross-cutting important themes for the IDB Group. So let me start with gender and inclusion. We've got a group of people that not only the board, in our conversations with the board, we said that globally in our institution, at least 30% of our business has to be focused on transactions or relationships that develop more gender and diversity and inclusion. And in that sense, the work that we do through our technical assistance is providing that knowledge for that to happen. So that's one space. Second space, and very important, is climate finance. We all know the impact that climate has had in the region, but in particular in the Caribbean, and that's why increasingly our activities, close to 35% of our business relates to climate finance projects. So we've got a group of people that are focused on adapting all the facilities and all the businesses that we're doing to mitigate the consequences and proactively alleviate the consequences of a change in temperature in the planet. Third, what we call environment and social governance. This is particularly important when it comes to infrastructure projects that have implications on the environment or on the social activities around the project. So we've got technical assistance that helps all the communities, engage with the communities and see the consequence that it has on the environment. And last but not least, the example of some of the work that we're doing with the banks is technical assistance in corporate governance. We've got a group of people that are experts in corporate governance, and the work that we do with financial institutions in the corporate sector is provide advice in those areas.
We've explained now in some situations that IDB Invest support the private sector, but we know that the public sector cannot be ignored. Can you please give us your insight on how the public-private sector partnership can be an opportunity for growth in Suriname?
I think it's a great opportunity, particularly in Suriname, but across the region. As Jade referred to a few minutes ago, the fiscal space that governments have in Latin America and the Caribbean is earmarked to address some of the short-term impact the pandemic has had. That leaves the space for it to look more strategically at the physical infrastructure projects that a country might have. What normally happens is that is a partnership that is developed between the public sector and the private sector, and it's traditionally called PPPs. A few years ago, there was a gathering led by IDB Group to talk about what does PPP mean for the region and what does that mean for Suriname. So we're in favor as a group to help the government of Suriname to develop the legal framework to do PPPs and incentivize the private sector to proactively engage in this sector.
I absolutely agree with what James just said. And for me to see that the government of Suriname, with the new recovery plan and also what James mentioned, the new Vision 2025 of the IDB in the lead of our new president, Mauricio Claver Carrone, and that really comes together. And seeing from both sides that we both see the need of the private-public partnerships to help in this recovery. And you mentioned, for example, big infrastructure projects, because again, I mentioned this many times before, with the COVID pandemic, the government has priorities that they need to take care of on short term. And so for the private sector to come in different areas that are also very important for economic growth, not only economic but also socially, it is definitely a good opportunity to start with a recovery in Suriname.
IDB Invest has been active in Suriname for some years now. I'm sure you have some beautiful upcoming projects in the pipeline. Can you share them with us, please?
So we recently looked at all the business that we're doing, and there are a number of projects in the infrastructure space that we plan to go to the board in the next few months. A good example of that is a port, the expansion of a port close to Paramaribo, to be able to prepare vessels that are coming from the discovery and expand that facility to be able to absorb the increased capacity from the discoveries. We are looking at closely a number of other projects in the infrastructure space. An example of that is solar plants. An example of that is the hospital that we're talking about. We're looking at airlines. So there are a number of different areas that we're looking at very closely, but I would say the one that's going to hit the press quite shortly is the port example.
I think one of the most important things of the pipeline is that we have been working together with the public sector and the private sector, because again, this is a joint effort in where the government is aware that we also need to take care of the medium and long-term goals. And not only, we have this pandemic going on with a health crisis, so asking for the effort and support from the private sector to also support, areas like infrastructure, hospitals, and manufacture, as you're saying. I think that is a good thing for us to focus on.
I want to say 3 messages to the audience through you. 1, we are optimistic of the long-term prospects of the country. 2, we're open for business. We have more interest in increasing our activities and investments in the country. And 3rd, we've got an office in the country. So the message that I want is, please help us help you. As an institution, our motto is improving lives. And we can only do it by investing knowledge and money into the country. So we have a presence on the ground. Please come to us. You can do it technologically, you can do it physically, but we're more than happy to continue to grow our investments in the country.
Thank you so much for your information, Mr. James Shriven and Ms. Jade Chon. You have a lot of work ahead of you, and we wish you all the best with making Suriname thrive. Thank you. Tot zover, dames en heren, hebben we het interview aan u gepresenteerd van de heer James Shriven en juffrouw Jade Chon, allebei van de IDB Groep, hier actief in Suriname, werkend aan de ontwikkeling van ons land. Hopelijk hebben wij u hiermee wat meer inzichten gegeven over de activiteiten van IDB Invest en wat de organisatie kan betekenen voor de ontwikkeling van ons land. Bedankt voor het kijken en tot de volgende keer.